My name's Sean Faircloth. I wrote a book called Attack of the Theocrats, How the Religious Right Harms Us All and What We Can Do About It. And since writing that book, I've become Director of Strategy and Policy with the Richard Dawkins Foundation. I served 10 years in the Maine State Legislature, and a lot of what I write about and speak about and organize for is informed by my experience in politics, where I saw the religious right have their way, particularly in American politics, with laws, public policy. I'm not just talking about social attitudes, but actually passing statutes that have a religious bias. Counterintuitively, we're talking about this in America, where the First Amendment allegedly prohibits an establishment of religion, but that's the reality of it. Yeah.
Excellent. So on the cover of Attack of the Theocrats, it looks as though you've got a hydra with 3 heads in it.
Oh, in the hardcover, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So it's got 3 heads. Now the symbology going back to Greek mythology is that when you cut a head off the hydra, it goes back and there's 2 in its place. Yes. So you have to make sure that when you cut it off, you inflame the stub so that it actually it doesn't grow back.
Wow, I've never had that imagery explained to me so well.
Well, I just thought that there might have been some sort of symbolic...
Maybe with the artist.
Yeah. Okay.
But I guess my approach is more about showing what the problem is, and I hope by way of exposing the reality of the harms from religious bias, that then people, and I think the majority of people, say, well, they don't want to associate themselves with religious bias. Most well-known, of course, is the religious bias about prejudice against gay people and imposing a religious view on women's control of their own bodies. But I write about 8 more areas of law, including a rather significant number of laws having to do with children, where there's religious bias, and really just to illustrate how pervasive the problem has become in the United States, and then talk about what we're going to do about it together. And I'm really talking about a worldwide effort to do something about it.
Well, it's interesting. Is this the 10-point plan that you've put together with the Richard Dawkins Foundation?
Yeah. And also there's a 10-point vision of a secular America, which really is sort of a counterbalance to the 10 areas of law where there's injustice. And furthermore, what I find particularly troubling is that the religious right expressly wants to make fundamentalist extremism a export business, and they have. You look at Uganda, where we hear about the horrific laws that say, well, death penalty for someone who's gay. It sounds beyond comprehension. Well, religious right groups in the United States specifically funded and proselytized to help spur anti-gay laws in places like Uganda. And it's not limited to the developing world. It's also, the religious right is working their magic, if you will, in places like Australia, where they're really trying to gain a foothold as well. So it's an international effort, and I think it requires an international counterbalance effort for the secular perspective.
Do you think Australia should approach the secular, the problems with church and state in the same way that America should?
Well, perhaps you mean in terms of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, or is that what you're getting at?
We know that like there's religiosity built into ours, but not yours.
Yes. I think that we have seen for the last 40 years, unfortunately, a successful grassroots effort by the religious right to build power in American political life, to the degree that, and with the success that, they have veto power over one of 2 major political parties in the United States. That's pretty successful, given that they, frankly, do not constitute half the population by any stretch. In fact, I argue in my book that secular people and people with secular views are a more significant portion of the American population, but our failure is not to have organized in a significant way, both in the U.S. but also internationally. And that's really my mission with the book and my mission with the Richard Dawkins Foundation.
It's amazing how much a small religious lobby group can steer politics.
Well, they've gotten pretty big. There's several policy advocacy groups, several of which are multi-million dollars in their efforts. Focus on the Family is well over $100 million, just one organization. Some people jokingly or ominously refer to Colorado Springs as the Vatican of fundamentalist Protestantism in the United States, because you have focus on the family. Ted Haggard used to be there, and it's a real center for that viewpoint. And they've had significant success. But I see us, secular people, as really on the crest of having tremendous success. But it requires more than us just congratulating ourselves that our numbers are increasing. I think we really need to organize.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions. I'm not really sure if they directly relate to your field of expertise. But since you're on the Richard Dawkins Foundation, I thought I might pen this in.
Sure.
So talk about the psychology and maybe even the evolutionary psychology of the reason why people believe what they believe.
Well, I wouldn't claim to be an evolutionary psychologist. I'm a lawyer, politician, lobbyist, which everybody loves all three of those. My own observation about it, and it's only an observation, people can take it for what it's worth, but my worry, especially about the most insidious parts of religion, and I do think we have to recognize there's variation in religion. I mean, people who are Unitarian Universalists, for example, are very often very close to our perspective on church-state issues and even on issues of ultimate questions of the existence of God and so forth. So there's lots of variation within religion. But particularly with those who advocate for a more fundamentalist, a more harsh point of view based upon religion, I see it as connected to a desire, even a lust for authoritarianism, a certain personality type that wants absolutism in their answers. And the other thing about it that's simply perpetuating it, of course, is mere generational coincidence. That is to say, as Richard Dawkins has often pointed out, well, what a coincidence that if you're, happen to be born in a Hindu family, well, that happens to be the religion that you adhere to most likely. And if you're born into a fundamentalist Protestant family, then you adhere to that. Rather than, if we were taking a reasoned and science view, which is the mission of the foundation, you would simply base your conclusion on evidence. And it's really important for us that children be given the human right to learn about all religions, learn about all philosophies, and make their own judgments, rather than be labeled by the time they're 6 or something that they are supposedly a Catholic child, which I think is an offense to a child to be treated that way. I would add, though, and this isn't related to your neuroscience that you're discussing, but it's an interesting observation. There was a study that came out the other day, University of California study, that talked about ethical behavior and the types of mindsets that engage in or support ethical behavior. And they found, counterintuitively to some, but not counterintuitively to me, that people who approach the world or even are primed by thoughts of science and scientific thinking tend to adhere more to an ethical perspective, tend more to be concerned and rejecting of mistreatment of women or physical force against others and that sort of thing. And like I say, some people say, well, science is cold and clinical. I don't view it that way. I think of the reason and science perspective of this foundation as one that ultimately leads to compassion, because if you are viewing the world from an objective perspective and are willing to readjust your views based on evidence and willing to not make judgments based on surface differences, I think that leads one to a sense of justice.
So what about belief in belief? I mean, the belief in faith, in other words. Like, even people who don't believe that, there's a God, playing harps in clouds or whatnot, and there's a devil with a forked tail. So I'm just thinking, these people believe that it's good to do this?
Yeah, I heard from, I was in a panel discussion just yesterday as we were recording this at Sydney Opera House, and we had, as one of the guests, Prue Gower, who's an elected official here in Australia, and she may be religious or not. I wasn't quite clear her own position, but she kind of made that argument, the utilitarian argument, that religion somehow makes people do good things. And I know a lot of people adhere to that view. I don't necessarily buy that that's even true. As I described with this recent study from University of California, I think people who are taking a scientific and rationalist perspective, I think often espouse more ethical viewpoints. And I have to say, in my day-to-day existence as an elected official, that was my experience. I'd hear people when I was in the committee room and we were talking about equality for gay people or women's reproductive rights, they'd use the word moral a lot. The religious right types would use that word a lot. But the result that they sought to me was very questionable in terms of morality. But they have that label that they get to use that somehow it's associated. And I do think people like, she's welcome to her opinion, but that people say, well, this is somehow utilitarian. I don't think that plays out when you look at the evidence. Look at the evidence of nations that in fact are less religious. Australia being one, Denmark and Sweden being another couple of examples. If you want to talk about fair treatment of other people, equality for women, egalitarianism, those countries are doing pretty darn well, and they're relatively not religious compared to the vast majority of other nations.
Yeah, the bias against stem cell treatment and the research.
Absolutely. Well, of course, to me, it's absolutely loony. I mean, here's something that really can potentially help people with Parkinson's and huge numbers of very horrible diseases. And the scientific potential is significant. They've made even progress with that. And of course, in the United States, there were policies that were they annoyed me because these policies, they'd pat themselves on the back about how moral and thoughtful they were and say, well, if you're moral and thoughtful, let's get off the dime here and help these people who are sick. That would be the moral thing to do. But yet somehow, because it's a religious perspective, we're supposed to defer to something that, as far as I can tell, doesn't have any basis in logic, evidence, or reason at all. I understand what you're saying. My take on that, and this is just my perspective, is how you weigh public policy is, I presume that, if one were a public policy leader when they invented the train in the early 1800s, there were bad things about trains, coal and, they pollute the air, and there's issues of safety involving trains. And those are all valid things that one needs to balance and consider with any new tool, any one that comes along. But I guess I view the tools that are modern and whiz-bang to us, whether it's nanotechnology or what have you, there is potential that something dangerous could happen or something harmful could happen. But my sense is more that we treat them through a rational and reasoned process, and when something comes up as a disadvantage, we work on legislation or public policy that measures that. Certainly, the most scary example perhaps of all technologies is nuclear weapons, where science was able to come up with a method of creating this, and obviously it creates huge hazards, and there's no doubt that there can be those kinds of downsides. However, when I look at science and technology overall over the course of history, and I guess I'm most particularly thinking of the last 400 years or so since the Enlightenment really got clicking, overall it's pretty good. Overall, human lifespan has dramatically increased. People live much more comfortable and wealthy lives in developed nations. So there are problems, but I sort of agree with Steven Pinker and his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, that we need to be cautious and careful, but that overall, encouraging technology and growth is a positive if we are judicious about it.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I do think that there's so much wonderful things that technology has already brought us and that technology will likely bring us. But sometimes I think that there needs to be some forms of legislation. I'm not saying what right now, but for instance, I don't believe in the precautionary principle taken to the nth degree, in which basically you can't do anything new because anything new is unknown,
untested.
And therefore you can't balance the risks of staying stagnant than to the benefits of progressing.
And similarly, that for me, when someone makes a religious assertion, as I've often seen in politics and legislation, we shouldn't have some kind of oddly hands-off approach. Well, that's a religious perspective, so we'll respect that perspective and not question it. I would defend the right of anyone to have any religious viewpoint they want to express, and they should have that right. But we should be able to impose scrutiny from a rational perspective on, does that test out based on evidence? And unfortunately in society today, a lot of religious assertions are somehow exempted from the test of rationality that applies most everywhere else in any civic discussion. I mean, in my book I go into, because I think it's the right thing to raise it, but it's also the strategic thing to raise it, is these issues with children, where religion says, well, corporal punishment is good, so they get laws that allow for more corporal punishment. Well, it seems to me, if you want to advocate for corporal punishment, advocate for physical punishment of children openly on a rational basis. Don't tell me that we should ignore what's happening because of religion, or with faith healing laws in the United States, sadly, or in Australia, where there are a number of schools, particularly in recent years, fundamentalist schools, that teach outrageous things with Australian tax money, like that the universe was created in 6 24-hour days. That's an abhorrent use of tax money. And I don't care whether they say they, teach the scientific method during one part of the day, but in the same school in the later part of the day, if they discount what the science says, that's a mistreatment of children, and we need to stand up for children and make sure they're respected enough to get a decent education.
It's interesting, some religions have actually drunk from the chalice of enlightenment, and it seems like the Anglican Church especially seems to be embracing a lot of science and a lot of theories and casting off some of the religious dogmas. Do you think now that they have really begun the drinking from this chalice of enlightenment, it'll sort of burn all the way down and turn them into some sort of another sect of the Unitarian?
I'm hopeful. Indeed, I find other secular people are sometimes more skeptical or less hopeful than I am about the progress of secularism and the victory of reason and science. But the context I put it in is that for a long time they were saying 200,000 years of human history. Now with the recent study, I guess they're talking about 300,000 years of human history. But whatever the case, a really long time of our species being around by the standards of our lifetimes anyway. And only for about 400 years have we really had the Enlightenment in a formalized sense where human beings are utilizing it more as a process. And so given that scale of time, I'm rather optimistic that not necessarily a week from Tuesday, but that within a conceivable future that a lot of religion may fade away. Not because I dislike religious people or have any animosity toward them, but simply because as our species sort of awakens, we'll start to cast those old things aside.
But I think that there's a lot of bias entrenched in our physiology. I mean, 300,000, as you say, years of existing in like 150 people, Dunbar number clans, and society was very different back then, and the means to survival was extremely different back then too. It's kind of amazing we've come so far in the last 10,000 years since we had agrarian civilization. We've discovered metals, we've discovered writing, we can make paper, printing, the scientific method, industrial society, information technology.
Right.
Here we are, and I'm recording these with some gadgets. I don't know what goes inside that camera, but the intelligent technologies that we've developed are all around us, and I think it's just going to become more and more. But so last point then. How do we then navigate through our biases? I mean, some of our intuitive biases, intuitions to morality may be right, and some of them may be wrong. How should we meter the difference?
Well, for me, and this is, again, just not a philosopher's answer, but simply a lowly, former elected official and political organizer, is that do it almost by experimentation. What's wrong with that? When I look at these laws that I write about in my book with religious bias, I say put it to the test like any other policy and say, well, what happens when you, for example, in 13 states in America, remove some or all of religious child cares from regulation of health and safety laws? Well, I think the evidence shows that children are less safe in those situations. Whether you like religion or don't like religion, that's simply what happens when it plays out, when you don't have health and safety laws applicable to child care. Again, in Australia, I would strongly encourage people in Australia to say, okay, if there's a school getting tax money that teaches, for example, that the Earth was created in 6 24-hour days, or there's another one, a school in Australia with tax money, it says we're warriors for Jesus in a world that rejects him, or something like that. What kind of education are those kids getting? Understand what kind of tools they're being given to go through life. And if it turns out that they are not getting an objective sense of the world, and most importantly, not being given the tools to know how to think, to apply critical reasoning, not necessarily to be handed the answers, but to apply critical thinking to the world, then those children are being done a disservice, and we need to speak out for them. So to me, that's the guide of moral action, is really how do things play out issue by issue, piece by piece. And I think if we keep the guiding star of reason and science and compassion, we work our way in the right direction.
Education in schools, I think it'd be great to teach high school students critical thinking tools and make that a solid theme in the curriculum. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that that's probably the most important thing that young people can learn, is the how to think, the interest in questioning, testing things based on evidence. That, to me, is the most essential education. We certainly want people to learn lots of facts and information, but the bigger issue is how are you going to approach facts when you're confronted with them.
Excellent.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.